Today I'm joined by AFPC Central Asia-Caucasus Institute Director Svante Cornell to discuss what's going on in the South Caucasus. Svante, in Georgia, the government arrested the main opposition leader, Nika Melia, and this happened after Prime Minister Gakari resigned over the court order to arrest Melia, leading to the return of former Prime Minister Garibashvili. What is the background of this decision?
Well, so there are several bottoms to this box, so to speak. The most immediate issue is that the optics of arresting a main opposition leader are definitely not very good for Georgia, especially when Georgia has prided itself on being the forerunner in terms of democratic development in the region. And when the Biden administration is coming in promising to give greater attention to the issue of democracy and human rights in US foreign policy. So that's the context. But the broader issue, of course, is it's a very strange situation when you have a prime minister in a government resigning because his own government is planning the arrest of an opposition leader. Now, in the particular case of Georgia, what this really relates to is the role of the business tycoon Bidzina Ivanishvili, who, of course, has been behind the scenes running the country for the past, almost for the past decade. Just to recap, Ivanishvili was the leader who funded the opposition to Saakashvili's government back in 2012. And Melia, of course, who was arrested today, is the leader of what was once Saakashvili's party, the United National Movement. Now, Ivanishvili, who made several $billions in Russia in the 1990s, he was prime minister for about a year and then left politics. He's been forced over time to make it kind of clear against his wishes that he is really the person in charge of the Georgian Dream Party and of the Georgian Dream government. And it's kind of a hidden secret that nothing in the Georgian government takes place without Ivanishvili either approving it or deciding it, although he really doesn't have any formal position, which is why the opposition in Georgia and many observers, Georgian and foreign alike, talk about state capture. And I think we have to understand this very strange situation within this context, because if the prime minister resigns because his own government is planning to go ahead and arrest the opposition leader, that means there's somebody else who's making the decisions and not the prime minister. And I think that became very clear. And that has happened in the past. A former prime minister, Mr. Kvirikashvili, who was a very prominent banker, also resigned from being the leader of the government a few years ago after disagreements, public disagreements with Mr. Ivanishvili over the course of Georgian politics. Um, so there are several things here. One is the fact that it's going to be very difficult for Georgia to wash away the stain of having directly went ahead and jailed the leader of the main opposition party. For example, prominently Eastern European politicians. I saw a Lithuanian politician who just expressed, that we never arrested any opposition politician, and it's just not credible for you to be doing this. But I think the broader issue is how the role of Mr. Ivanishvili in Georgian politics as somebody who has from behind the scene captured the state more or less is going to become increasingly problematic.
And in response, the U.S. Embassy released a strongly worded statement concluding that Georgia is indeed backtracking. What about U.S. engagement with Georgia on this specific issue?
Well, for the past 4 years, it really hasn't been very much. The Trump administration had a fairly good approach to Central Asia. They launched a strategy for Central Asia that was well received, but in the South Caucasus, there's been very little. John Bolton made a trip there when he was National Security Advisor. Aside from that, there hasn't been very much. Secretary Pompeo made his last visit to Secretary of State to Georgia, but that was very late in the administration, and I don't know how seriously that was taken. So there's been a drift in Georgia for a very long time. The U.S. has been the main external promoter of Georgia, both in terms of Georgia's democracy, Georgia's security. But this really puts the United States in a bind, because for the past several years, we haven't been very active, which means that the legitimacy, the credibility of the United States in the region has been an open question. I would note that there was a war between Georgia's two neighbors, Armenia and Azerbaijan, just this past September, October, and the U.S. footprint in that war was extremely limited. what the US said and did really didn't matter to the outcome of that war. And obviously, leaders like Mr. Ivanishvili have taken note that, well, maybe we don't have to pay that much attention to what the United States says. So in a way, that's the hole from which the United States now has to climb out as far as its influence in the South Caucasus in general, but more specifically in Georgia now rests. Obviously, the Biden administration has a national security team, but it doesn't really have a State Department team in place regarding this region. Pretty much everybody's in an acting capacity, and in a way, this is one an early crisis that the Biden administration will have to respond to. And I think the statement that they made was stronger than I expected, perhaps, which I think is a good sign, but just statements are not going to cut it. And what is going to be necessary is, in this Georgian context, is not just talking to the elected politicians or appointed politicians, because the person who really calls the shots is not I think it's going to be key for somebody to talk to Mr. Ivanishvili personally and explain what the United States position is and what the risks are if they go ahead with this trajectory.
So what do you think the next steps will be? Sort of what is the potential outcome here?
Well, that is very unclear. I think there are nothing good, I think, is short. Georgian society has come a long way in the past 20 years. In the past 30 years from independence, we've gone through periods of, Edward Shevardnadze was president and Saakashvili, and now various people under Ivanishvili's suzerainty, if you will. But Georgian society has developed tremendously. Georgian society is not ready to accept, I think, a backtracking into some form of authoritarian government or state capture. And there was early on, especially last summer, there was a certain level of rallying around the flag because the government had handled the first phase of the COVID pandemic fairly well. But that has also worsened in the fall and winter. And the economic situation is also very problematic, which I think means that maybe Mr. Ivanishvili feels he needs to tighten the screws in order to remain in power. I'm not sure. But I have a hard time seeing Georgian society in the long run accepting the situation. Then you have the factor of Russia, which of course is very happy to see a situation where Georgia is being estranged from the West, as is likely to be the consequence of this, because both Europe and the United States are going to find it harder to support Georgia if the government engages in this type of activity. But I think in the very short term, the question really is how much unrest we have on Georgian streets, because Georgia has a history of, if you will, adjudicating political disputes, not in the parliament, but on the streets. We've had the Rose Revolution in 2003, then there were large demonstrations that undermined Saakashvili's position in power. We had only not that long ago a huge demonstrations about a year and a half ago because of a Russian parliamentarian spoke from the Georgian parliament in a way that upset a lot of people and forced the government to make concessions. And it seems to me that it's very possible that this again triggers a new round of political instability in the country, which could get very ugly. And then the question is, what do you do about it, and what can the United States do to stop that kind of development?
Okay, and I think just on the tail end of that, how does this impact American interests in that region?
Well, so that's the big question for the United States again, is to defining what are our interests, but also where does a country like Georgia fit into broader U.S. interests with regard to bigger powers. And I think the problem for the Caucasus is it's very strategic and it's also very small. And there's always a tendency for it to become kind of an appendix to either Russia policy or Turkey policy or Iran policy or even Afghanistan policy, where the situation right now is one where the United States, of course, find itself, whether it likes it or not, in what the national security strategy called strategic competition with Eurasian great powers like China and Russia. And if anything, the Biden administration in this regard has a lot of continuity with the Trump administration. Not with Trump personally, who of course always had some penchant for Vladimir Putin and was a break on harsher U.S. measures against Russia, but it's clear that in spite of Trump, the administration was imposing increasingly punitive measures on Russia, while of course having worsening relations with China. There is nothing that suggests that the Biden administration is going to go in a different direction. And then you're back into the question of, then the countries that are in between the great powers of Eurasia, between China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, matter to U.S. policy. And if you don't have Georgia, if you don't have the South Caucasus, you don't have access into Central Asia, which is why I think it seems to me that the United States should pay attention, and looks like it's paying attention to this. There's also the issue of American prestige. For, well, over 25 years, the US has invested a lot of attention, a lot of energy, a lot of political in Georgia. And if Georgia really backtracks, that is going to be seen definitely as a failure of American policy, which will be noted far beyond Georgia itself.
Thank you for your time,
Thank
Svante.
you indeed.
I will talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.